So here's a question for you. Should parents really get worked up? Should we really care about the books that are available in our kids' public libraries or the books that are read by the teachers to our kids during story time? How involved should a parent be in what their children are being read to or taught in our public schools? That's what we're going to talk about today on Life Talks. My name is Dan Burrell, and I'm one of the teaching pastors at Life Fellowship in suburban Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm joined today also with Josh Brahm, who is our executive producer, but he also is the founder and president of the Equal Rights Institute and is an apologist. He is an expert on helping people put together their worldview. So I'm so glad, Josh, you're with us today as we discuss this. So let me lay the groundwork for this.
Yeah.
So there was a court case in the Supreme Court recently where this is involving the state of Maryland. Mm-hmm. And so the state of Maryland has, by the way, one of the lowest records for math achievement and reading in the United States.
That's not what you want to be known for.
That's not what you're known for. And interestingly, in the last 10 years or so it's just like falling off of a cliff.
Like, that's extra bad because, like, America's pretty bad compared to the rest of the world. So it's like, you want to be on the worst of the worst.
Absolutely. They have absolutely falling off the cliff.
We need to work on this.
But the court case has nothing to do with math or science or whatever. It is about some books that are part of the curriculum available for many of the all the school districts in Maryland that have very, very specific LGBTQ type themes to them. So there's one of the books, it's about pride parades, and you go through the book, and I've seen digital copies of it. They would have like the letter P stands for pride, or the letter G stands for gay, and these are things that you would see at a pride parade, and there are depictions of drag queens. So D stands for drag queen. Now, this book is supposedly appropriate for children 3 to 7 years of age.
It's pretty young.
When they're learning their alphabet, they're going through and learning the verbiage of the LGBTQ community, the lexicon. So there's another one about a prince who's gay. There's another one about 2 men getting married, another about 2 women in a relationship. So there's a total of 5 of these books. All of them have these very explicit, specific LGBTQ terms that present them in a positive light and also teaches the children how to respond. It normalizes these things. So there are people in the state of Maryland, and of course they went national, who are saying, no. The argument isn't over even the books. Now, it's not even about the books being in the library. The argument is, can a parent pull their child out of a class during the time that this book is being read?
Right.
So this is a parental rights issue fundamentally. But it has triggered a lot of thought for me. Society has changed a lot. When I was in 7th grade, Josh, it's going to make you laugh. When I was in 7th grade, I was taking life science, and I was in public schools.
The Titanic had just gone down.
That is so cold. But we celebrated the first Earth Day when I was a 7th grader. And Earth Day was
first
recent.
Earth Day.
Yes, was when I
when was the first Earth Day? I don't
about
even know.
1972 or 3.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I remember it was a big deal. We made posters, and
I was homeschooled. We never celebrated Earth Day. I'm sure you're going to be shocked by that, but a conservative homeschool kid, I didn't know Earth Day was a thing.
No worshiping Mother Earth allowed, right?
Yeah.
But in the school life science, we got to the reproductive part. And my parents pulled me out of the classroom. I had to go sit in the library with probably 5 or 6 other kids from very conservative Christian homes.
I was going to ask, like, how common was that? Because opting out of these things, I know, feel like it's been pretty across the board for, I would imagine, a pretty long time. Like, was that weird at the time, and it's only more recently?
It was still a little weird at the time. It was
like, what percentage of the class got pulled out?
Probably, I would say, because there were 2 sections of it being probably about 10 to 15%.
Okay.
About the same amount that wouldn't go to the teen dances that they were introducing us to dances. So I got pulled out of those as well.
Right.
I couldn't even go square dancing.
That would definitely be a problem if young Dan is square dancing with a girl
square dancing with pictures
dance.
With pictures of sex education in my head.
Right.
We joke about it and laugh about that, but historically we do know this. Parents have always felt a right and a responsibility to have a voice in their child's education, particularly a public education.
Yeah.
And part of the argument is you don't have to send your kids to public school. Well, not everybody has the wherewithal or even the desire to send their kid to a private Christian school or a private school of some sort, or to be able to homeschool.
Yeah, not everyone can homeschool.
Not everybody can homeschool. It takes a special gift to be able to do that, and it's hard work. So the parents sued the state of Maryland. The state of Maryland was basically saying, no, you cannot opt your kids out of it. We'll not tell you in advance. And if you do find out in advance, you cannot take your kids out of the classroom.
And that's where this gets pretty crazy. Like I was listening to, so if anyone likes to nerd out on Supreme Court cases, then I highly recommend a podcast called Advisory Opinions with David French and Sarah Isger from the Dispatch. But like they are like, just like, they understand the Supreme Court at such a level. And so they're talking about this and just how crazy this particular case was. Like, this was a really dumb decision for Maryland to make, to decide, like, we are going to push this case to the Supreme Court. Because whenever you're thinking about whether you want a Supreme Court case, and having worked in the pro-life movement for a long time, we've spent a lot of time thinking about when do you want Supreme Court cases going up and not. It's like, you have to think about the potential consequences of losing. You want it to be a really good case that you put up. And this is such a bad case for the state of Maryland.
Really
they handled this situation so extra terribly that I think it's like kind of obvious what's going to happen. But this is like, I think I at least want it to be clear that yes, there's probably a lot of bad things that can happen in various school districts across the country. It sounds like what was happening here in Maryland was on the pretty far extreme end as compared to what happens a lot of times.
Absolutely. When you have Justice Kagan questioning, she said even non-religious parents are going to have a problem with some of this content because she doesn't feel like it's age appropriate.
Yeah,
because the interesting thing
there's a member of the Dispatch who's in a gay marriage, and he said that he wouldn't read this book to his kids. Kind of a thing. Like,
interesting.
Come on.
Yeah. So. That, because it is a rather, and I think I use this word appropriately, flamboyant case, because it does have everybody else's attention. I wanted to talk about it a little bit here because I want to go back and talk to parents a little bit about what happens is over the course of time, we normalize some things. And that's why I have a problem with this book. We're normalizing for young children relationships that are fundamentally immoral if you hold to a biblical worldview. So, two men living together, having sexual relations. And by the way, you don't have to be anti-LGBTQ to be horrified at often what happens in certain pride parades in major cities in this country. There's explicit nudity. There is huge efforts on the part of some to mock, particularly Catholicism, but various religions. There's sadomasochism that's acted out, and so forth. Every year when it hits our town of Charlotte, there'll be broadcasts about it on their news and so forth. And I'll see parents with little children. Of course, you've seen on X and other social media networks where parents will take their kids to drag shows and give their kids money to hand or put in the garters or whatever. And that level of parenting, in my opinion, to me, that's just emotional, psychological abuse just to begin with. But of course, they would say that it is emotional and psychological abuse to take your kids to a church and have them learn about hell and the devil and the crucifixion. So,
which can be abusive depending on how it's done.
Depending on
right?
how you do it, absolutely. Yeah. So, but
on both sides.
There has always been an assumption in this country that while the schools are in loco parentis, which means in the place of the parent legally, whenever you send them to their school, because they're responsible for their care and well-being, that's how you ensure accountability. Yep. At the same time, parents have always had the privilege, the right to say, the school needs to support my values. At the very least, it needs to not denigrate my values. So the culture wars, they've been around for 50, 60 years, really longer than that, but they're obvious. So the question I want to answer today is why should parents care and so forth? And so that's kind of where I think we want to form our discussion, because here's the first reason we ought to care, because your kids begin forming their worldview as soon as they become aware of the ability to communicate. when a 2-year-old is playing with their sibling or their friend and a fight breaks out, and you say, no, we must take turns or we must share. You're forming worldview at that moment. When you show affection to your spouse in front of your children, which I believe is healthy and normal. I'm not talking about something sexual. I'm just talking about genuine affection, the affection that husbands and wives should have for each other. You're helping to form their worldview and also their perspective regarding normalcy. So books are not neutral. Books always have an agenda. They often carry underlying messages about everything from identity and morality to history and information and process and all things. So the idea that books are somehow just these amoral objects that really don't have influence and power is ludicrous to the person who understands the purpose of writing. And so the Christian is taught to be careful about those. The scripture says, take every thought into captivity. That's important for adults, but it's even more important for a child who basically begins as a blank slate. And so everything they're taking is making an impression. And it's not necessarily an impression that they're aware that they are forming. And I think that's true with us adults sometimes. We get worn away by the constant messages until the things that used to be important to us are no longer important. Bigger battles come. So we compromise step by step. And we finally say, you know what? They're the experts. They're the people with the degrees. They're the people who have been hired to do this. I'm just going to trust them. And in doing so, we open up our kids' minds to all kinds of indoctrination. So worldview to me is important.
Yeah. So I've got a clarification question for you. So the Maryland case, one of the things that that I identified or resonated with that they were talking about on the Advisory Opinions podcast was the difference in this case between sort of like exposure versus, I don't know if they were using this word, but let's say indoctrination for lack of a better word, because this was not just a case where some of these books are in the school library along with all the other books. Right. Which I think is a pretty common thing and feels pretty different than what was actually happening in this case, where like the teachers are being taught if certain like questions come up from the students that are like opposed, then you basically come down hard and basically say like the Christian worldview is hurtful and things like that. So it's more of like you are really teaching these kids that what your parents teach you is wrong and hurtful. And so I'm curious. I know like. And we might be a little bit different on this. Like we've definitely wanted to allow our kids to be exposed to alternative ideas, and it's kind of as they get older, even it's like we're okay with them being exposed to people who would even try to kind of change their minds, and let's like have those conversations, but be able to have those open communication. Are you okay with some of the exposure side? Like if some of the books are in the school library, as long as you know about it, you can have those conversations, or is that even hard for you?
That's a really complicated answer, and I'm happy to answer it on extended. First of all, I'm against public schools.
Okay.
So that's where we start there.
Okay.
I believe all children constitutionally should be given the opportunity to have an education.
Yes.
But I think the public school system that we have today is broken beyond repair.
Wow.
And it needs to be rebuilt. And so while I think there'll always be a need for government involvement in schools to make sure that every child in America who's here should be getting educated, and by the way, I'm not your typical conservative. I would say even children of illegal immigrants should have the right to an education.
Yes.
I believe that is a universal skill that blesses, and that is part of it. But you can argue with me about this. Here's another thing that I'm outside of conservative mainstream in. I'm against public schools having prayer and Bible study in them, like what's going on in Oklahoma.
Me too.
The reason for that is I don't want a Seventh-day Adventist or a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon or a Catholic teaching my kids their spiritual values, because Christianity is far too complicated and diverse. I mean, there's 1,300 different denominations.
So there's important differences in there.
Yeah, and it's some really important. I don't send my kids to school to get their spiritual education. Right. I'll take care of that. Thank you very much.
We want them to learn stems and stuff like that.
So a lot of my conservative friends, they get all worked up about, well, they took prayer out of schools. Prayer out of schools again, for me, said more about our culture and a shift in our culture and our country, but very little in terms of the impact. And when I was in public schools, even after that decision had been made, we still prayed over our milk and cookies. I'm not super comfortable with required pledges. I really struggle with that.
Me too.
So, and I'm a flag waving American. I'm glad to be here or whatever, but it feels coercive to me. So what if what if I lived in the Soviet Union growing up, because it was quite there, and they wanted me to get up and pledge my allegiance to something. So I believe anything that is
similar feelings too. Okay.
So things that are coercive. And again, write me your emails and tell me why I'm wrong, and I'm okay.
LifeTalks@lifecharlotte.com.
I'll listen respectfully, but these are my opinions, and you should know that within conservatism, within Christianity, within people with a biblical worldview, there are variations.
Right.
But I think on this we can agree that age appropriateness is essential, and I don't think anybody can make a strong argument for saying it is important to teach things that are outside of the norm. I don't think kids that are that age need to know things that are inside the norms. They're still making mud pies and playing with dolls and making guns out of sticks and silly things like that.
I think there's probably like a few things. Like I think I'm probably more convinced now than I would have been like 10 years ago how young it's important probably for kids to at least learn basic concepts like consent and things like that.
Yeah.
To like avoid predation, things like that.
Good touch, bad touch. Yeah, all of that.
And there are some conservative parents that would be like, oh, don't you dare talk to them about like anything. And I'd be like, yeah, I think there's some things I really want them, but then there's some other things that at least parents should have, I think, the opportunity to opt
I think all of us would want to have our kids be in a safe environment, and in an environment where the average male child is exposed to pornography at age 8. Right. There are things that we have to be aware of that's part of the general culture.
That makes it even more important to be talking about consent. That's a good point. I haven't even thought about that.
Absolutely. And if you had said something about consent to me when I was in high school or even college, I would have laughed at you. What in the world are you talking about? Culture shifts, and we have to make our shifts with it, which is why I think you see such a huge explosion. People talk about COVID, and COVID did give it a boost, but homeschooling was booming well before COVID, and a lot of parents are simply saying, I'm going to be responsible for this. And they have a right to. I think in some cases they have a responsibility to. And you say, oh, but I know some really weird kids that were homeschooled. Yeah, and I know some really weird kids that went all the way through public schools and private schools too. Weird kids are around. But you know what?
And some of us were homeschooled and aren't that super weird by this point, like we got out of it.
Yeah, well, and that's the reality. People say, well, they need more socialization. My kids who were homeschooled up through 6th grade, they did not need more socialization. They got tons of it. Yeah. And in some cases, we need to ask the question, what benefit is socialization making to my kids? Because when I grew up, the kids that were most popular that wanted to be more social often were the class clowns, and so
I think what's important is getting them. I think it's important for young, and I don't know a lot about this, but I've been hearing Jonathan Haidt recently wrote a really interesting book on like the way that cell phone use, social media use is affecting young brains, coming from a pretty scientific standpoint. He's a social psychologist. And so I'm pretty I'm kind of in agreement with him on a lot of like the kind of like the concerns about like there's some things that are just like not helpful, but I do want young kids at least being impressed on about like some of these basics. Some of these things are like, hey,
and here's what I stand. If as a parent you believe that your child needs to understand more about sexual practices, sexual practices that are outside of norms, things that I would consider to be immoral and unbiblical, unhealthy, and other things. But you as the parent can, at your own volition, introduce your kids to them. The books are available at Amazon and the bookstore nearest you.
And there's really good ones too, like not just the bad ones. Like there's really good books.
There are books that explain, how to navigate that. But the thing is, when we relinquish control of what is the influence in our kids' life, whether we do it actively by saying you're going to go to the public school and you're going to sit in the classroom, or we do it passively by saying here's a cell phone. Yeah. But whether we are accountable, we need to be renewed in our concept of parental responsibility in this country, and the fact that your kids are being shipped off to a Christian school or a public school or a private school is your kids will should not be learning their values by proxy.
Yeah.
They should be learning their values from mom and dad, and mom and dad should be actively engaged in the influences in their kids' life. That includes what they read, it includes where they go to school, but also includes what they consume at the movies or on their devices or on your TV or from the lips of your own mouth and the conduct that you demonstrate for them. So parental responsibility needs to have a revival, I think, in America. And I will tell you that if my kids were in public school in Maryland, I'd be at the front of this battle if my kids were there, because it is, and I speak as an educator, it is I consider to be abusive to be exposing kids 3, 4, 5 years age to things like leather for those with sexual. I want to say deviancies, but what
BDSM kinds of
BDSM, the nudity
play,
and quite frankly. I still, as an adult, am not comfortable watching two dudes kiss on TV because it offends my sense of right and wrong. And nor am I comfortable with watching an abusive man beat on his wife, even if it's part of the storyline. That makes me uncomfortable, makes me squirm. The reason it does is because at some point in my life, my values were established to be in alignment with the absolute unchanging truths of Scripture. And that is a responsibility of a parent to make sure that you provide for them that baseline, that baseline of this is right, this is wrong.
And you've got these awesome opportunities when you're watching things for those conversations. Like, I know not to keep on hampering on my thing on consent, but like if you think of like so many of the old movies, like Empire Strikes Back. I'm a big Star Wars fan. I love Star Wars.
I've never even seen it. Sorry.
Oh man. Okay. So this is okay. Well, there's a lot of movies with classic examples of the cool guy who's with the girl and she doesn't really want it. She's kind of like stop, and he's kind of like so awesome, and he like forces a kiss on her, and then she like swoons, like that whole thing. There's a famous example of that in Empire Strikes Back. But there's a lot of it. But like those are opportunities to be like, hey, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what exactly happened. So I've got a question for you, not to put you totally on the spot, but just thinking, I was thinking recently about, I was just talking to someone about a gay pride parade that he's going to go and do like a kind of a Christian outreach with. And I was telling him about how I've seen these pictures on Instagram of really cool Christians going to pride parades with signs that are sort of all about like something like reunification or something like a sign that's like, I'm so sorry for how the church has treated you, like that kind of a thing. And then seeing these pictures of these big old, bear type guys bawling and hugging these pastors and stuff, and just like that kind of like they're not expecting that. So my question for you, since we agree that it ought to be parents primarily teaching their kids about sex in general, morality in general, like all of those things, what would be some important things for Christian parents to teach their kids about LGBT issues past not ages 3 to 5, but like when they're like in their teens? What are some important things that you would hope Christian parents would teach their kids when talking about this? And I can give a couple of examples if you want off the top of my head. It's like my kids have LGBT friends or friends who at least think of themselves as LGBT. So it's like, love them. Love them so well and treat them the way that you treat everyone else. Like don't bully them. Don't make fun of them for this, and understand how hard it is to be a teenager that it feels like you're one of those orientations, like trying to make sure that they've got some compassion so they kind of handle this well. What are some things that you would hope Christian parents would kind of impress on the kids?
And it's been a while since I've had kids that age. It's been a decade. It's been a decade since I've had kids that age. But, one of the things that I want to do, it's very easy for us to get into a mindset that says, ooh, LGBTQ, oh, that's wicked. That's horrible. That's horrible. But sleeping with your girlfriend before marriage, oh, that's the way the world goes. Wearing, what is the organization that parents, who have gay kids, I can't remember the name of the organization, but there's an organization, the people who are friends of gay people.
I'm sorry, I wish I knew, but
I can't remember the name of it. Somebody will send it to me or whatever. But I think we have to be careful about endorsing any level of sin.
Yes.
Now we're aware of it.
Yes.
We are. But when we get comfortable with it, to me, it is not compassionate and it is not loving to endorse behavior that damns people. So whether that is lying or immorality of any way, shape, or form, blasphemy or whatever, when we participate in and endorse activity that is forbidden by Scripture, I believe we've crossed the line. So how do we handle that? The way I've always wanted to handle it, and the way I've taught my kids is sinner's going to sin. All right? So sinner's going to sin. I sin too, but I know it and I acknowledge it, and I should ask for forgiveness, and I shouldn't try to repeat it.
Yeah.
The other thing I always want to be aware of, your sin drives me nuts, but I kind of like mine.
Yeah.
So it's really, really careful that we don't develop a pious or judgmental attitude, because any sin separates us from God, and the sin damns us. Right. So
notice Christians never talk about gluttony.
Never talk about gluttony. We never talk about laziness. We never talk. I've seen 350, 400-pound pastors just rant and rave about smoking cigarettes, and the Bible never says a word about smoking cigarettes. So, but I got to tell you, smoking a cigarette and then eating that second quarter pounder with cheese and and your kids' leftover Happy Meal, that the Bible does say stuff about that. Yeah. So we have to be
this balancing thing,
and the Scripture says, beware of the mote or of the beam in your eye while you're trying to get the speck out of your friend's eye. Yeah. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we should culturally, politically, personally, or morally give in to the dominant culture, which is exactly what Lot did. Lot pitched his tent right towards Sodom. And then next thing we know, he moves to Sodom. And then the next thing we know, he sits in the gates with the leaders. He was popular in Sodom. Everybody loved him. And they made him one of the elders that sat at the gates. And then eventually he offers his virgin daughters to the homosexuals that are raging outside of his house, wanting to get at the beautiful angels that apparently look like young men inside. And he said, I want to leave them alone, because he didn't want God to get upset with him. He said, take my daughters instead. And then the next thing we know is he's delivered with his daughters. And what does he do? He gets drunk and sleeps with them. So there is a progression in how that we will justify, rationalize. That's a worst case scenario. I can't think of anything that could go much worse than that. Hopefully none of us would go there. But the reality is, all of us should never underestimate our ability to do things that violate God's word and which grieve God's heart. So those are the lessons we ought to be teaching at home. We ought to engage the culture with grace and truth, and on things that God is dogmatic on. We can be dogmatic without being obnoxious. But parents, I think we have a responsibility to protect the innocence of our child for as long as is possible. But when that time comes, and I'm not going to tell you when that time is, but when that time comes, you'll be aware of it, and you begin introducing your kids for their protection, things that will rob them of the innocence of a 3-year-old who likes to run around the house naked. But then, it's cute when your little 2 or 3-year-old gets naked and runs around the house. It's not cute when your 13-year-old does it. Right. So at some point, we know between those 2 points that you're going to start saying, no, we cover up. This is why we cover up. And this is a good touch and this is a bad touch. And by the way, your body is changing. And these are things that are going to happen to you. And a lot of parents just say, you know what, that makes me uncomfortable, so I'm not going to deal with it.
Yes.
Let the schools deal with it.
Right.
Let the church deal with it, or whatever. It's not my job to raise your kids, nor was it your job to raise my kids. Parenting is not something that we ought to be doing by proxy, but rather we ought to be the primary disciple makers in the life and in the home, lives of our kids and in our home. And when we do that, therefore, we do become protective about the influences that impact our kids. But you will stand before God, not me. You will stand before God for how your kids turn out. So by taking it seriously, you may get involved with what your kids are being exposed to at public school, at Christian school, in your homeschool play group, in your very house in terms of the media and what they consume on their screens. We're way out of time, but thanks for listening. I hope we've triggered some thoughts. I hope you'll think about it. I hope maybe you'll write some questions and we'll do our best to answer them. But as always, we're privileged to have you listen to us at Life Talks. We hope you'll share us on your social media networks. And until next time, thanks as always for joining us here at Life Talks.